Hello and welcome to Cat Politics. Over the last year, Big Cat and Small Cat have been enthralled by the US presidential election campaign that will come to a head in November. In particular, the unexpected success of Donald Trump has been fascinating for them to watch. How did a man with no political experience and a dubious reputation come to win the Republican Party nomination? Does he stand any chance of beating the Democratic Party's nominee, Hillary Clinton? The Cats have taken a closer look and have a few thoughts on the matter, as well as an interesting theory about a surprising parallel with British politics. To quickly summarise Donald Trump as a political figure is a bit tricky. In the past he's denoted to the Democratic Party and been a vocal supporter of some of their policies, and yet in 2011 he announced his intention to stand as a candidate for the Republican Party. This was generally ridiculed at the time, but in 2015 he was true to his word and entered the Republican race to be their presidential nominee. At first, he was again dismissed not only by commentators in the media, but by respected establishment figures within the party. But as he gained support from voters, these internal party adversaries became even more strident in their opposition. Nevertheless, he secured enough votes from the party members to win the presidential nomination at the party convention in July of this year, defeating 11 other candidates, many of whom were party luminaries or long-standing politicians. So what made him stand out from the crowd? From the offset, it became clear that Donald Trump was not a typical politician. He was frequently vague or contradictory about his policies and quickly gained a reputation for breaking conventional norms of behaviour, being all too willing to level personal attacks against the character and background of the other candidates, and frequently taking to social media to belittle or outright insult his opponents. Against expectations, Republican Party members lapped up his brand of straight talking and dismissed or ignored his abrasive demeanour and lack of credible policy details. With the Republican nomination secured, Trump has now switched his attention to the presidential race proper. But rather than adopting a more mainstream approach as many expected, he continues to employ the same firebrand and frequently offensive style. To list the controversies that have dogged his campaign to date would take longer than the Cats have in this video. But the highlights include insulting the family of a Muslim US serviceman killed in action, insisting that he build a wall along the Mexican border and make the Mexican government pay for it, and claiming that many illegal immigrants to the US are rapists and thieves. Despite his support from Republican Party members, the latest polls suggest that Mr. Trump is deeply unpopular with the wider US electorate. He trails his Democratic opponent in all major swing states, whose voters are most likely to decide the election one way or another, and is particularly disliked by black, Hispanic and female voters. Even members of his own party have openly stated that they will not vote for him in the election. Assuming that the polls have at least a degree of accuracy, it seems fairly certain that Trump will lose the presidential election and potentially cause the Republican Party to lose control of Congress, the US equivalent of Parliament. If Donald Trump is such a toxic political figure, seemingly doomed to destroy or fragment his own party, the big question for the Cats is how did this happen? To answer this question, we have to take a trip back in time and look at the history of politics in the US and Europe. It's safe to say that the very essence of politics has always been about representing different views and opinions. Is society more important than the individual? Do the rich have an obligation to help the poor, or is it every man for himself? These questions have been central to Western politics for hundreds of years, with two major viewpoints forming the basis behind the divisions of left and right-wing ideals. It's tricky to summarise the qualities that typify a left or right-wing political ideology, but probably the easiest way to do so is in terms of government intervention in everyday life. Left-wing parties generally seek to minimise inequality and as such favour policies that exert a greater degree of control over people and businesses, whether in terms of individual liberty, wealth or obligations to the state. Right-wing parties tend to see inequality as an inevitability and seek to maximise the opportunities for people and businesses to succeed by removing any controls that might limit their growth or advancement. This idea of left or right-wing politics has dominated US and European politics since the early 20th century, if not earlier. However, since World War II, the political landscape has been undergoing what statisticians call regression to the mean. In essence, the range of acceptable policies has tended towards an average of the traditionally polarised views of left and right-wing parties. A good example in the UK is the National Health Service. Introducing a free healthcare system paid for by all members of society equally is an obvious left-wing idea. but subsequent right-wing governments have sought to deregulate many of its functions by providing greater and greater freedom and autonomy for hospitals to operate as they see fit. Industries such as railways and the postal service have also been privatised, a right-wing idea, but with extremely limited competition and retaining significant public funding, a left-wing idea. Over time, political parties have drifted towards a compromise centre ground, which in Europe has given rise to ever more frequent coalition governments as it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish between left and right-wing political views. You'd think that this averaging process would generally be a good thing, leading to more stability and prosperity, and that has generally been the case. As long as everything was going okay, people stopped caring about politics and got on with their daily lives. Indeed, declining voter turnout may well have been a side effect of this averaging process. Which brings us to the financial crash of 2008. As a result of investors gambling on high-risk loans, the wheels fell off the entire world economy, with the US and Europe being the hardest hit. People lost their jobs, whole countries went bust, and the world entered an unprecedented period of economic hardship. Now, normally when things go this badly wrong, the incumbent government takes the blame and is defeated at the next election, and this was certainly the case in some countries, but as new elections were called, people began to realise that there really wasn't much difference between the solutions being proposed by the various parties and candidates, all of which looked depressingly similar to the ideas that brought about the financial crash in the first place. If things haven't been working with one way of doing things, then people naturally look for an alternative, but in this case, they have become increasingly frustrated by a lack of options. This has led voters to embrace more and more radical or extreme views, and across Europe and the USA, politicians who offered any kind of radical solution have gained unprecedented levels of support. For most of these candidates or parties, the details of how the economic problems would be solved isn't important. It's more about the rhetoric of taking a different approach, or simply deriding the existing political establishment and promising that things will be better if you vote for me. This idea of making vague or insubstantial claims and pandering directly to the fears or desires of the man in the street is called populism. Which brings us back to Donald Trump. Mr. Trump is the perfect example of a populist demagogue. He is outside of the existing establishment, is extremely critical of accepted political and economic policies, and addresses supporters in an uncensored tone that panders to their hopes and fears. His campaign slogan of "Make America Great Again" is typical of populism. It lacks any clear details, is implicitly critical of the establishment, and appeals directly to voters who feel let down or unhappy. So what does all of this have to do with British politics? Well, Big Cat and Small Cat have a radical theory about this, so it's time to put on your tinfoil hats. Let's start by listing the key features of a populist politician or movement. They're not part of or distance themselves from the political establishment. They propose controversial ideas in many policy areas. They're critical of well-established political and economic theories. They promise a fundamentally different way of doing things. And they're generally unpopular with many beyond their core support within their own party. So who in British politics do you think Big Cat and Small Cat are reminded of? If you said Nigel Farage, good guess, but wrong. Mr. Farage certainly employed a particularly shameless brand of populist rhetoric that was a significant factor in the Leave campaign winning the referendum, but he's no longer an influential figure in UK politics. So who else fits the bill? Brace yourselves. Jeremy Corbyn. Whilst the two men could hardly be more different when considered as individuals, Big Cat and Small Cat see a lot of similarities in the nature of the Labour leader's support to that of populist leaders in general, and Donald Trump in particular. It's clear that he represents a break from traditional centre-left political ideas, and he enjoys a huge amount of support from disgruntled Labour Party members. However, many MPs within his own party are openly against his leadership, and he is the most unpopular opposition leader at this point in the election cycle for 30 years. In light of this theory, the Cats are particularly intrigued to see what happens in the aftermath of the Labour leadership contest, as it may give some indications of likely outcomes in the US presidential election as well as the future of UK politics in general. Will the Republican and Labour parties collapse into bitter infighting or split into separate parties altogether? Do the unconventional views of Messrs Corbyn and Trump truly represent a viable alternative to the accepted political norms, Or are their campaign promises and policy theories too impractical or unattractive to achieve election success ever? So what do you think? Are the cats right about Mr. Trump and Mr. Corbyn? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. But for now, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.